Welcome back. Next year marks the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. In many ways, an accidental, horrifying war that killed millions, scarred nations, and changed the world forever, and would eventually lead to World War II. A new book is out this week by famed Canadian historian and award-winning author Margaret MacMillan. It is called The War That Ended Peace, a remarkable and, I have to say, very readable work as well about how World War I happened, the events, the triggers, and the flawed leaders who stumbled their countries into tragedy. Margaret MacMillan is my guest here in studio. This is amazing for me to read this, how at that time in the world it was an advanced, civilized society, very rational. They never imagined that they were on the cusp of this horrifying war.
I think that's what makes it so fascinating to us, because here is this continent which had enjoyed the most extraordinary period of peace, 100 years of progress, prosperity, increasing prosperity, the most powerful part of the world, and yet they destroyed themselves in 4 years.
You also, and you touch upon this many, many times in the book, talk about the flawed leaders, those who found themselves in power in certain key countries, notably Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm, but also Russia under Tsar Nicholas II, and how some of the decisions that were made by these men led to this.
I think that's always the difficulty in writing history, is sorting out the great pressures in history, the great movements like nationalism, and the role of the key individuals. And it really mattered, particularly in autocracies and in monarchies, who was in power. And Wilhelm II was a deeply flawed person. Nicholas II in Russia was a very weak character. But in the end, they had the power of life and death.
And you see how the weakness of one man, or in this case, a couple of different men, can lead to this sort of thing, either through action or inaction.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're thinking at the moment about leadership and how important it is in all sorts of contexts, including in Toronto and so on. And I think, yeah, it really did matter. And if someone else, if Wilhelm the father had stayed on the throne and hadn't died after three months, we might have had a very different outcome. But Wilhelm was erratic, unstable, deeply concerned about prestige, and in the end he was persuaded to go to war.
You, of course, were the one who wrote the acclaimed book Paris 1919 that talked about how the Treaty of Versailles came to be, and after World War I. What were you trying to accomplish in this book, which sets up what led to the war?
I think what I was trying to do is give people a sense of what that world was like in the first place, and what were the pressures on the decision makers, and what were the things that Europeans worried about, and what were the things that they cared about, and why it was. I was trying to explain why it was that enough people in the summer of 1914, when you had yet another crisis in the Balkans, why it was that people thought war was a reasonable option. Why on earth, I kept asking myself, didn't they foresee what was coming?
It wasn't inevitable.
I don't think it was inevitable. I think very little in human affairs is inevitable. I think there are often choices, crucial choices, that can be made. And in the last months of 1914, in that summer of 1914, the very last weeks, there was crucial choices made which could have gone the other way.
You also talk about, and what's funny is that this era before the war was this wonderful sort of golden period of security and peace and stability, not everywhere, but in a number of these key countries, and how so quickly it all fell apart.
And it shocked the Europeans themselves. I know, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, one moment most of them were on holidays, people were at the seaside enjoying themselves. A week later, they were scrambling to get home. The communications all across Europe were being cut. The battlefields were already becoming this terrible, bloody slaughterhouse that they were becoming. And they went from war to peace with surprising quickness and surprising ease.
It's also remarkable when you think about the fact that Wilhelm II, Nicholas II, and the King of England as well, they were all related. They were related by blood.
Yeah, they were cousins. And in a funny way, you would think, in a way, being members of the same families, that they wouldn't want to go to war. But we all know what family fights can be like. And unfortunately, this ended up being a particularly nasty fight.
You also trace the sort of decline, slow decline of the British Empire. And what's interesting is some of the parallels, and one specific part of the book, you talk about China and the United States, because in this context, it was the slow decline of the British Empire and the rise of Germany.
Yeah. I think it's always difficult in international relations when you have a period of transition, and what you had before 1914, and I think we're seeing it now, was a power that had been the dominant power, and that had been Britain and its empire. And today, of course, the United States, and you get rising powers pushing up against that. And the dominant powers are often unresponsive to the rising powers, and the rising powers often feel very insecure and uncertain of themselves and want their place in the sun. And it's a difficult time for all of us, because those changes have to be managed very carefully.
Looking back now, almost 100 years since the war broke out, from our vantage point in 2013, why is it important for us to remember and read about what happened?
I think for Canadians it's important because it was one of the things that helped to shape us as a nation. Many things have shaped us, but the First World War was a time when we moved down the road to full nationhood. I think it's also important to remember because it was such a transformative event in modern history. I mean, the losses, you referred to them earlier on, the long-term consequences. I mean, I think we wouldn't have seen the rise of communism and the rise of fascism without the First World War. And we're still living, I think, in some ways with its consequences. And I think the final reason is we have to be very careful not to do the same thing again.
Because there's parallels that you see
Yeah.
between 1913, 2013, and 1914, and possibly 2014.
I think there are parallels, and I don't think history ever repeats itself, but I think we have to be careful not to blunder into very dangerous situations. I mean, I think the South China Sea, for example, at the moment is very dangerous because of conflict between China and its neighbors, with the United States somewhere there in the background also involved, and Russia somewhere in the background also involved. And so there are these dangerous flashpoints in the world, and I think we learned from the First World War how very quickly such flashpoints can draw in the great powers and turn into a general conflagration.
And you also see really quickly about how all of these events are linked. You can't see them individually. The First World War, the Second World War, they all blend into one another, don't they?
Yes, I think you can't see them in isolation, and you have to think of the sequence in which they happened. We wouldn't have had the Second World War without the First World War.
Margaret MacMillan, the name of the book is The War That Ended Peace. It is a wonderful book. I've had the opportunity to read it. Thank you so much, and I'd recommend it to anyone. Thanks for coming in today as well.
Thank you so much.
And safe travels back to the UK.
Thanks.